Hello, dear friends. It's now Chol Hamoed, which is the interim days of the Passover holiday, Haggadah Pesach. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of the Haggadah and its antiquity, which I think is just a few words about this item. When we look at the Haggadah and the people in the Haggadah, we can see when the main part of the structure of the Haggadah was probably put together. For instance, the names that we find in the Haggadah, Rabbi Akiba, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Gamliel, all these are second century personalities, which most probably means that the structure of the Haggadah was formulated to a great part in the second century after the destruction of the temple. Another thing we can see in the Haggadah to prove this point is when it talks about Hillel the elder, and talks about the fact that he ate the Paschal offering in the first century as a sandwich of the matzah and the maror, the bitter herbs, and the Paschal offering within this sandwich. It says, Hillel bizman shabeit hamikdash haya kayam. This is what Hillel used to do when the temple was around, meaning if the first century when Hillel was alive was called used to in the past, that means that we're talking here, of course, of these individuals who I mentioned before in the second century. However, the many items, many elements within the Passover Haggadah are quite old, and were used most probably in the Second Temple period. Indication from this, of course, we can find from the Mishnah, in Psachim. And the Mishnah says, I will read to you now. This is the 10th chapter of Psachim, which is called Arvei Psachim. And I'm reading from Mishnah 3. I'll read it in English. The attendants brought vegetables before the leader of the Seder. So it says, actually, I wanted before this, excuse me. Okay, unfortunately, I'll have to go to the Hebrew because sometimes the English I find a little bit difficult. Okay, here we are again. So this is Psachim, Arvei Psachim, chapter 10. Mazgulo kos sheni. They poured for him the second cup. And here the son asks his father. What does the son ask his father? He asks him some questions about the Passover Haggadah. Im ein dat babed. If the son doesn't know how to ask a question, then Aviv Lamdo, the father teaches him Manishtana Lailazeh, which is the famous 4 questions of the Passover Haggadah. Now here we see that actually the son is supposed to ask. It's only if the son cannot ask a question, doesn't have that ability, then the father teaches him the standard default, which is the 4 questions, the 4 kashas, as we say in Yiddish, or the manishtana. And of course, the questions here are 3 of them are the same as in our Passover Haggadah, and 1 is different. It says, how is this night different than all other nights? That all other nights we can eat unleavened bread or leavened bread, chametz or matzah or chametz. Alay lazeh, but tonight only unleavened bread, only matzah. So b'chol haleilot, any other night we can eat any type of vegetables, but tonight we eat the maror, the bitter herbs. And any night, now this is different than on Passover Haggadah. And in any night we can eat roasted or cooked or baked meat, but tonight we only eat roasted meat. Then all other nights we can, this is of course different than our Passover Haggadah, which took this question out and instead replaced it with a question about reclining. That in most nights we can either recline or sit regularly, and tonight we recline. And then of course the 4th question has about dipping twice. So why was this taken out, and why was it in the original Mishnah of the 4 questions? Well, the question about eating roasted meat, of course, applies to the Paschal offering, which according to the Torah in Shmot, in Exodus chapter 12, had to be roasted on the fire, and could not be cooked in water, and also could not be raw. So when the child saw this, he would ask the question, why does it have to be cooked necessarily in the fire? And this could be a legitimate question. After the destruction of the temple, however, this was not something a child could see because they were now at home and not doing this. So therefore, it was not part of the Passover questions of the Manishtana. But what it does indicate that the 4 questions of the Manishtana are quite early and were practiced during temple times. Now, the fact they were practiced during temple times could have been the 1st century, before the year 70, but definitely during the temple, which means the Haggadah that we have today, even though it presents to us an alternative to what was done in temple times with the Paschal offering on the temple, it seems that it incorporated many of the elements which were actually recited on the Temple Mount during the time of eating the Paschal offering. Now, if we look at other things in this same Mishnah that I just quoted, the Mishnah continues. It says, Matchil Begnut. You start off, when you're talking about the Haggadah, the story of telling the story. I mean, when you tell the story of the Exodus story, Matchil Begnut, you start off with the negative and you finish with the positive, which is what we do today. We start off saying that first we were slaves to Paro, and then God took us out of Egypt. And we have a second answer that first our forefathers, Terach, the father of Abraham, was an idol worshiper, and then God brought us to his worship. And then also the second thing that the Mishnah says that we recite the passages in Deuteronomy. Now, this passages in Deuteronomy are passages that are recited when a person brings the Bikurim, which is the first fruit to the temple. Bikurim, which is the first fruit to the temple. Now, where is this taken from? It's taken from the book of Deuteronomy, Arami Oved Avi. So, Arami Oved Avi is from Parashat Navo. That's Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. So there are a few verses here which are recited because they encapsulate the Exodus story within just a few verses. And that's exactly why they are recited. Because we have a mitzvah on this night to tell the story of the Exodus. So I'll just put it up for you in a moment. So it's Deuteronomy, Barim, chapter 26. So this is from verse 5. You say, Arami Oved Avi, which means my father was almost, Jacob meaning, was almost killed by an Aramean, or at least destroyed by an Aramean. In Hebrew, it's Oved. And he went out to Egypt, and they were very few when they went to Egypt. And he became a great nation there. That's verse 5. And then the Egyptians did terrible things to us and persecuted us and gave us hard labor, verse 6. And then we called out to God, the God of our fathers, and God heard our voice and saw our affliction, and he took us out, verse 8, from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with many signs. Verse 9, and he brought us to this place, this land, and gave us this land, a land of milk and honey. So you have here encapsulated from verse 5 till verse 8 the story of the Exodus. And because the Magid is a mitzvah tonight to tell the story of the Exodus, and because I assume in temple times, there wasn't a long time to sit on the Temple Mount. Remember, there were a lot of people who had to come in the Second Temple period to fulfill their mitzvah of eating the Paschal offering. So probably they bought into lambs that were being prepared for this on the temple night, and everybody got a small amount, which they ate of a Paschal offering on this night with their families, and they had to tell the story at the same time. So since there wasn't a lot of time, so you had to encapsulate it within a few verses, and here the book of Deuteronomy does it for us in these 6, 7, 8, into these 4 verses. So the fact that this Mishnah mentions those verses and mentions the answer to the Manishtana means that the Manishtana was said during temple times, 4 questions. The answer to the 4 questions was also practiced during temple times. And also these 4 verses, which we do together today in the Haggadah, and we bring rabbinic interpretations to these 4 verses, was also done during temple times. Now, in Daniel Goldsmith's Haggadah, which is called the Scholar's Haggadah, he also brings a very old manuscript from the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, in which it seems to be a manuscript from the Second Temple period of the Haggadah, and which also includes this part of Aramia Veda V, these 4 verses, and some of the rabbinic interpretations that were given on these verses. I want to, another thing we can notice also in the Haggadah, which makes it obvious that the things in the Haggadah from the Second Temple period. I'll give you another example. The 4 sons, right? There are 4 sons in the Haggadah: the Chacham, the wise; the Rasha, the rebellious; the Tam, which is the simple one; and the She'eno Yodeh Lishol, doesn't know how to ask. The 4 sons in a Braita brought in the Talmud Yerushalmi, it mentions about the 4 sons when it talks about the Tam, the simple one. So it says, it doesn't call him the Tam, the simple one, it calls him the Tipesh, the ignoramus, who doesn't really know, or the fool, doesn't really know much. And it says that you have to teach him certain things about the law so that he doesn't drift off to another group of people, to another chavura. That is the term which is used. Now, the term chavura is also used by the Talmud to explain that a person, when they bought a Paschal offering, it was for the whole group, for their family, maybe their relatives too, a few families, and they would sit in a chavura, which was a group. So you don't want the simple son drifting off in the middle of a very public scene and getting lost in one of the other groups. So you have to explain to him the way things go tonight, and he should stay within our group, not to be lost. But here's another indication that the 4 sons were done in temple times, because according to the Yerushalmi, one of the reasons that we have to tell him these things is that he doesn't drift off to another group, which is referring to the groups on the Temple Mount. Another indication of the fact that our Manishtana, that our Haggadah, a lot of it was done in temple times, is the unusual structure of the Hallel, which is the famous prayer of praise that we say on Jewish holidays. And in Israel, we say it both night and day. On Passover, outside of Israel, only Sfaradim say it at night, Ashkenazim during the day. And the Hallel is also said in the Haggadah. But in the Haggadah, the Hallel is basically verses from the book of Psalms, from the book of Tehillim, and these verses all talk about praising God and giving thanks. The Haggadah, though, is structured very unusual. First, we have the 2 passages from Psalms, the first 2 of the Hallel. The second one, of course, which talks about leaving Egypt, so it's quite appropriate. Then we break, for some reason, which is called Hallel, then Motzi Matzah. We take as if, so it goes, Kadesh, Ruchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. Of course, we don't call it Hallel yet, but we actually do start the Hallel there. We call Hallel after. So we say the first 2 passages of the Hallel. Then we break for eating the matzah, eating the maror, and eating them together. Then we have the meal Shulchan Aruch. Then we have Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. And then we continue the Hallel from the 3rd Psalm, which is usually in the Hallel till the end. Why in the middle? What's going on? It looks almost as if we started the Hallel, but we got hungry, so we had to start the meal, and then we continue. But when you understand that this was recited on the Temple Mount, it makes 100% logic. On the Temple Mount, when they finish Magid, when they finish telling the story of the Exodus, which is before eating the Paschal offering, then what they do is they have two sections of the Hallel, which is giving praise, which also talks about the Exodus, and that's where they stop. Then they eat the matzah and the maror and the Paschal offering. Now, the Paschal offering, of course, had to be eaten when the person was full and satiated. So first they ate what was called the offering of the festival, the Korban Chagiga. Then they ate the Paschal offering. They made the blessing after the meal, and then they finished the Hallel. In other words, the idea was that praise is given before and after the eating of the Paschal offering. Now it makes sense. In other words, that structure of our Haggadah must have also taken place during temple times, or else it would have made more sense to say the Hallel after. And the most interesting indication of our Haggadah being quite ancient, you can find in some of the apocryphal books, which I heard years ago from Professor Shinan. So in the Book of Jubilees 49, which is written by an anonymous Jew, this is a book which is written in the Second Temple period, probably in the 2nd century, in the latter part of the 2nd century under the Hasmonean Empire, saying the 2nd century before the Common Era, just to be clear. This is right in the middle of the Second Temple period. And he's describing things in the Torah, in Jewish history, and he finishes more or less with the Egypt story. And in chapter 49, there are 50 chapters, it says, the plague was grievous in Egypt. There was no house in Egypt where there was not dead, weep, and lamentation. He's talking about the 10th plague, where the angel of God slew all the firstborns of the Egyptians and passed over the houses of the Israelites. Now I'm going to verse 9. And all of Israel was eating the meat of the Paschal offering and drinking wine and giving praise and blessing and giving thanks to the Lord God of their fathers, and was ready to go forth from under the yoke of Egypt, from the evil bondage. A very unusual verse. Now this verse, I assume, is referring to Exodus chapter 12. In Exodus chapter 12, it does say that on the night before they left Egypt, they ate for the Paschal offering, which they had prepared during that day, the 14th, and ate it that night, which was the 15th. And then they left in the middle of the night. However, in the book of Exodus, it does not say that they drank wine, that they gave praise, that they made blessings, that they gave thanks. But it does say they were ready to go forth, and they were walking stick, and their girds were, and their loins were girded. They were all ready. But it doesn't say they were drinking wine, making blessings, giving thanks, giving praise. So where did this anonymous author of the Book of Jubilees take the idea from? Why did he superimpose it on the book of Exodus? The answer is very simple. This fellow was used to every year going up to the temple on Passover, where, of course, they ate the Paschal offering. And he saw that all the groups eating the Paschal offering were drinking wine, probably the 4 cups that we do also at the Seder. And they were giving thanks, which is called the Hallel, which I said before is split up before and after the meal, because that's the way it was done with the Paschal offering, and giving blessings and praising God, meaning all these aspects, which are in our Haggadah, were done already in the 2nd century before the Common Era and Temple times. So what we see here is that and this fellow assumed that if we do it today, this is what they did also in Egypt. They left Egypt because it must be an old tradition. That's why he superimposed it on the story. So what I'm showing here is in the structure of Haggadah enters into some type of addition or editing in the 2nd century under Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. And then, but there are early elements of the Haggadah, as found in the manuscript from the Paragoniza, which show that in temple times, a lot of it was done also in the Mishnah, also the Yerushalmi that I mentioned, and definitely in the Book of Jubilees, that we can see that in the Second Temple period, there was a Haggadah that was recited on the Temple Mount during the time of the Paschal offering. This Haggadah probably contained the four questions that we had, the four sons, the main part of the story, which is called Magid, that we go from the negative to the positive. It also included probably the four cups of wines, probably the Hallel, a lot of aspects which are today in our Haggadah. And then things were added in the 2nd century, and then things were added also later on in the Middle Ages to the Haggadah, some of the songs which were added much later. So I just want to point this out. Sometimes we have traditions we think are from an older time. Actually, their roots start from much earlier. I wish everybody happy Pesach Chag Sameach.